Clara Whitmore's fingers dug into the rope around Molly's neck, and she would not let go, even when the auctioneer pried at her wrist and told her the bidding had already started. "Please," she said, her voice cracking in front of the whole town square. "Give me until Friday. Just until Friday." Nobody answered her. The gavel man only shook his head and pulled the rope free, and Clara stood there with empty hands in the summer heat, watching strangers decide the price of the last thing she owned. Subscribe and stay with me to the very end of this story, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from tonight, because I read every single one. The morning had started with a debt Clara Whitmore could not pay, and would end with a bargain she never expected to take. She stood at the edge of the town square in Valentine, Nebraska, her daughter Mary's small hand fisted in the fabric of her skirt, and she watched the auctioneer climb onto the flatbed wagon like a man mounting a pulpit. Behind her, tied to the hitching post, Molly, the cow, chewed at nothing, oblivious to the fact that she was about to be sold to whoever wanted her most. "Mama," Mary said, tugging once, twice. "Is that man gonna take Molly away?" Clara knelt down so she was eye level with her daughter, brushed a strand of pale hair from the girl's forehead, and made herself smile the way she had learned to smile for 4 years now, ever since her husband died and left her a house, a debt, and a child to raise alone. "Molly's going to a good family, sweetheart. She'll be happy. But she's ours." "I know. Why do we have to sell her?" Clara didn't have an answer that a 4-year-old could carry, so she said the only true thing she had. "Because sometimes grown-ups have to make hard choices, so their little girls can eat supper." The auctioneer's voice cracked across the square before Mary could ask another question that would break her mother clean in half. "Fine, milking cow, folks, gentle as a lamb, 3 years old, and still got plenty of good years in her. Who'll start me at $15? Silence answered him. Then laughter, low and ugly, rippling from a cluster of men near the feed store. $15 for a scrawny thing like that," one of them called out. "Widow Whitmore ought to be paying us to haul it off." More laughter. Clara felt her face burn, felt Mary's grip tighten on her skirt, and she made herself stand up straight because she had promised herself a long time ago that she would never let this town see her fold. Not even now. Not even with her stomach so empty it ached and her daughter watching every move she made. $10 then, the auctioneer tried. "Somebody give me $10 for a good milking cow." "I'll give you 5, a voice shouted, and the crowd howled with laughter again, because everybody in Valentine knew that Clara Whitmore had nothing left to bargain with, and cruelty always found its footing on the backs of people who could not fight back. A man stepped out from the crowd, and Clara recognized him before she remembered his name. Jedediah Crane, banker, note holder on half the failing farms in the county, and the man who had personally signed the letter demanding Clara's mortgage payment by the end of summer, or the county would take her land for the debt. He wore a black coat despite the heat, and he smiled the way men smile when they already know how a story ends. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, tipping his hat with mock courtesy, "I do hope you're not planning to fall behind on your note because you sold your cow for pocket change. A woman in your position ought to be more careful with what little she's got left." "I'm aware of my obligations, Mr. Crane. Are you?" "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like a woman who's about to lose everything she owns standing in the middle of the street, watching the last of it get auctioned for less than a bag of flour costs." He turned to the crowd, playing to them now the way he always did. "Might as well save everyone the trouble and hand me the deed today." "The note isn't due till the end of summer," Clara said, and she heard the tremble in her own voice, and hated it. "I have time." "Time?" Crane repeated, and laughed softly privately, like he was sharing a joke only he understood. "Time's the one thing you don't have, Mrs. Whitmore. But I admire the fight in you. Truly." Mary pressed her face against her mother's hip, and Clara set a protective hand on the back of her daughter's head, and for one terrible moment, she thought she might actually cry in front of every soul in Valentine, Nebraska, and she would rather have died than let that happen. "Do we have a bid?" the auctioneer called again, sounding almost apologetic now, like even he could feel how far this had sunk. "Somebody give me something, anything. $10 ain't worth getting out of bed for." another man muttered, and the crowd murmured its agreement, and Clara understood in that moment that they weren't going to buy her cow at all. They were going to let it sit there unsold, a public monument to her failure, because watching a widow lose everything was better entertainment than church on Sunday. $50. The voice came from behind the crowd, low and even, cutting through the noise like a blade through soft wood. Every head turned. Clara turned too, and found herself looking at a man she didn't recognize, tall, dark-haired, dressed like a ranch hand in a worn hat, and dusty leather gloves, standing with his boots planted like he had every right to be exactly where he was. $50, he said again, louder this time, stepping forward through the parting crowd. For the cow. The auctioneer blinked at him. 50, you sure about that, Mr. Cow like that ain't worth more than 15 on her best day. I said 50. The stranger's eyes hadn't left Clara's face, and there was something in them she couldn't name yet. Not pity, which she had learned to despise, but something steadier. You got a problem taking a man's money. No, sir, not at all, just... The auctioneer looked between Crane and the stranger, like a man caught between two fires, unsure which one would burn him worse. $50 going once. Now hold on. Crane's smile had thinned into something sharper. And who exactly are you, mister, throwing around $50 in the middle of my town? Ethan Calloway. He didn't offer his hand. Ranch hand out at the Morrison spread. A ranch hand with $50 to spend on a dying widow's cow. Crane's laugh had an edge to it now. That's either very generous or very foolish, Mr. Calloway. Reckon that's my business, not yours. Something in the way he said it made the crowd go quiet, made even Crane pause for half a second before he recovered his composure and waved a dismissive hand. Suit yourself. $50 for a $15 cow. I hope you enjoy your milk, Mr. Calloway. He turned to leave, then stopped and looked back at Clara with something cold behind his eyes. End of summer, Mrs. Whitmore. I'll be counting the days if you're not. He walked off through the crowd, and the townspeople began to disperse. 2. Their entertainment concluded, and Clara stood there with Mary's hand in hers, watching a stranger walk toward the auctioneer's wagon with 3 gold coins already in his palm. Going once, going twice, the auctioneer said, mostly for show now that everyone had stopped listening. Sold to Mr. Calloway for $50. Clara felt something break loose in her chest. Not relief exactly, more like the moment right before a dam gives way. $50 was more than 3 months of what Molly could earn in milk and butter. $50 could buy flour and salt pork and boots for Mary before the weather turned. It could buy a little time, even if it couldn't buy enough. She made herself walk toward the stranger, made herself hold her chin up the way her mother had taught her, because gratitude was one thing, but groveling was another, and she had already given this town enough of a show for one day. Mr. Calloway. He turned, and up close she could see he was younger than she'd first thought. Maybe 26 or 27, with eyes the color of a storm coming in over open plains. Ma'am, I don't know why you did that, but I thank you for it. Molly's gentle. She'll milk twice a day if you treat her right, and she doesn't spook easy. Clara reached for the lead rope, already working out how she would explain to Mary that Molly had a new home, already bracing herself for the sound her daughter would make when she understood. I can walk her over to your wagon if you tell me where it's... I don't want her. Clara stopped. I beg your pardon. I don't want the cow, Mrs. Whitmore. Ethan held the lead rope out to her, and for a moment neither of them moved to take it, the rope hanging between them like a question. I bought her so nobody else in this square could buy her for a dime and drag her off just to spite you. That's all. She's yours. Keep the money, too. That's... Clara shook her head, certain she had misheard him. That's not how an auction works, Mr. Calloway. You paid for her. She belongs to you now. Then I'm telling you what I want done with my property. His voice was calm, unhurried, the voice of a man who had decided something a long while before he ever opened his mouth. I want her back with the woman who raised her and the little girl who's been crying into her side, if that's all right with you. Mary, who had gone very still and very quiet through the whole exchange, peeked out from behind her mother's skirt. You ain't taking Molly. No, miss, I ain't taking Molly. Ethan crouched down the way a man crouches when he wants to make himself smaller and less frightening to a child, and Clara watched something in her daughter's shoulders unclench that had been clenched all morning. She's staying right here with you if you promise to look after her good. I always look after her good. I don't doubt it. Mary studied him with the frank, unguarded suspicion only small children could manage. Are you a nice man? Mary, Clara said, mortified. But Ethan only laughed a short, surprised sound, like the question had caught him somewhere he wasn't expecting. I've been called worse things, miss. I try to be. Clara found her voice again, though it came out thinner than she wanted. Mr. Calloway, I can't accept this. You spent $50 of your own money. I did. And you're just handing it back to me, cow included, and expecting nothing in return. Forgive me, but nobody does something for nothing. Not in this town, not anywhere I've ever lived. She had learned that lesson hard in the 4 years since Thomas died, learned it from bankers and neighbors and men who came around offering help with a price tag, hidden behind their smiles. So tell me plainly what you want, because I'd rather know now than be surprised later. Something shifted in his expression. Not offense, but a kind of understanding, like he'd expected exactly this and respected her for saying it out loud instead of letting it fester. Fair enough. You want it plain? I'll give it plain. He stood, and for a moment he looked past her toward the retreating shape of Jedediah Crane, disappearing into his bank building at the edge of the square. And something hard passed behind his storm-colored eyes before it smoothed away again. I heard what that man said to you. About the note. About the end of summer. That's not your concern. Maybe not. But I've got eyes and I've got ears, and I don't much care for watching a man like Crane corner a woman in the middle of the street like she's already lost before the fight's begun. He said it evenly without heat, but there was iron underneath the calm. I'm not asking for your land, Mrs. Whitmore. I'm not asking for your cow or your gratitude or anything you're imagining right now that's put that look on your face. Then what are you asking for? A chance. He said the word simply like it cost him something to say it, and he'd decided to pay the price anyway. A chance to help you keep what's yours. I've got wages saved from 3 years at the Morrison Ranch, and I've got 2 hands that know how to work a fence line and mend a roof and do whatever else needs doing before the end of summer comes calling. I'm offering you help plain and simple, and I'm asking you to let me give it. Clara stared at him, searching his face for the catch, the hidden condition, the thing men always wanted when they offered a widow help she hadn't asked for. She had seen that look before from Crane himself, who had once suggested delicately that her note troubles might disappear if she were more agreeable to him personally. She had seen it from the widow Hastings' nephew, who offered to fix her roof and then lingered at her door until she had to threaten him with a hayfork to get him to leave. She had learned the hard way that kindness from men in this town almost always came with strings sewn into the seams. Why would you do that for a stranger? Ethan was quiet for a moment, long enough that Clara thought he might not answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped lower, rougher, like he was reaching for something he didn't often say out loud. Because 3 years ago I stood by and watched something bad happen to somebody who needed help, and I told myself it wasn't my business, and I've regretted it every single day since. I don't aim to make that mistake twice. He looked at her directly, then no flinching, no softening the truth to make it easier to hear. That's the whole of it, ma'am. No hidden ledger, no price tag. Just a man trying to square something with himself. That's quite a confession to make to a stranger in a town square. You asked me plain. Seemed only right to answer the same way. Mary tugged at her mother's skirt again, patient as only a child waiting out 2 adults could be. Mama, can we keep Molly now? Can we go home? Clara looked down at her daughter, then back at Ethan Calloway, then at the lead rope, still hanging in the space between them, unclaimed by either of them, a small tether connecting 3 lives that had no business being connected an hour ago. She thought about the letter from Crane, locked in her kitchen drawer, the numbers that didn't add up no matter how many times she recalculated them at the table after Mary went to sleep, the nights she'd lain awake calculating exactly how many weeks of flour she had left before the well of her savings ran dry entirely. She thought about pride and how much of it she had left to spend, and whether pride had ever once put supper on her table. "I don't take charity, Mr. Calloway." "Good. I'm not offering any. I'm offering labor for wages. I'm not asking you to pay," which I understand sounds like the same thing, dressed up different, but it isn't, not to me. Charity is something you give because you feel sorry for somebody. This is something a man does because he decided a wrong needed righting, and you happen to be standing in the middle of it. He reached down and picked up the lead rope, closing the distance between them, and held it out to her a second time. "Take your cow home, Mrs. Whitmore. Think on what I said. I'll be back Thursday to mend that south fence line I heard you've been fighting with, whether you've made up your mind about the rest of it or not. A fence needs mending regardless of what a woman decides about a man's character." Clara took the rope. Their hands didn't touch, not quite, but she felt the nearness of it anyway, a strange warmth in the summer heat that had nothing to do with the sun. "You don't even know where I live." "Everybody in Valentine knows where the Whitmore place is, ma'am. It's the one with the mortgage note everybody in town's been placing bets on." He said it without cruelty, just plain fact, the way a man states the weather, and somehow that honesty landed softer than sympathy would have. "Thursday, then." He tipped his hat first to her, then to Mary, who beamed up at him like he'd hung the moon himself, and walked back toward the livery at the edge of the square, and Clara stood there holding a rope attached to a cow she thought she'd lost forever, watching a man she'd known for exactly 11 minutes disappear around the corner of the feed store. "Mama," Mary said, "I like him." "You don't know him, sweetheart." "I know he gave Molly back. That's enough for me." Clara almost smiled at that, the simple math of a 4-year-old's trust, but her mind was already working through the harder arithmetic of adulthood, what Ethan Calloway's offer would cost her in a town like Valentine, where a widow seen too often in the company of an unmarried man became the subject of every kitchen conversation from one end of the county to the other. She thought of Crane's parting words, the promise buried inside the threat. End of summer. "I'll be counting the days." She led Molly back toward the wagon, Mary skipping ahead of her, now that the crisis of the morning had resolved itself into something her small heart could carry, and Clara allowed herself exactly one glance back at the square at the bank building, where Jedediah Crane's shadow moved behind a curtained window, watching, always, watching the way a hawk watches a field before it decides which direction the wind favors. By the time she reached the wagon, Mrs. Odell was already waiting by the dry goods store, with her arms crossed and her mouth set in the particular line that meant gossip was imminent. "Well," Mrs. Odell said, not bothering with a greeting first. "That was quite a scene." "Good afternoon, Mrs. Odell." A ranch hand from the Morrison spread buying your cow and handing it right back. Tongues are already wagging clear down Main Street. Mrs. Odell's eyes glittered with the particular hunger of a woman who fed on other people's misfortune the way some fed on bread. "What exactly does a man like that want with a woman in your circumstances, Clara? You'd best think carefully before you answer, because this whole town's going to be asking the same question by supper time." "He offered to help fix my fence line." "Fence line?" Mrs. Odell repeated the words like they were a joke told poorly. "Is that what they're calling it these days?" "That's precisely what it is, Mrs. Odell. Nothing more, nothing less." Clara kept her voice even though her jaw had gone tight enough to ache. "And I'd thank you kindly to save your speculation for someone with the time to entertain it. I'm only saying a widow can't be too careful about her reputation, especially one so close to losing her land. People will talk, Clara. People already are. People have talked about me since the day Thomas died. I've managed to survive it so far." Clara loaded the last of her supplies into the wagon bed, lifted Mary up onto the bench seat, and climbed up after her with as much dignity as she could gather from a morning that had already stripped most of it away. "Good day, Mrs. Odell." She snapped the reins before the older woman could get another word in, and the wagon rolled out of the square past the bank, past the feed store, past the courthouse where the county recorded every mortgage, and every foreclosure, and every small tragedy that made up the ledger of a hard land in a hard year. And Clara did not look back again, because looking back had never once changed anything that lay ahead. The ride home took the better part of an hour past neighboring farms, fighting the same losing battle against drought and debt that Clara fought every single day. Mary chattered the whole way about Molly, about names for a calf that didn't exist yet, about whether the nice man with the storm-colored eyes might come back to visit. And Clara answered when she could, and let her mind wander when she couldn't, turning Ethan Calloway's words over like a coin she wasn't sure was counterfeit. A chance to help you keep what's yours. She wanted to believe it. That was the trouble. She wanted to believe it so badly that she distrusted the wanting itself, because wanting something too much had a way of blinding a person to the truth of it. And Clara Whitmore had already been blinded once in her life, back when Thomas had promised her the homestead would provide for them forever. Back before the drought and the debt and the fever that took him in a single terrible week 2 winters past. She had learned since then that promises were cheap, and follow-through was rare, and a man's generosity in a town square proved nothing about what he'd do once nobody was watching. And yet, there had been something in his voice when he spoke of the mistake he regretted. Something that hadn't sounded like a line rehearsed for effect. She had heard plenty of rehearsed lines in 4 years of widowhood from Crane, from the widow Hastings' nephew, from the traveling preacher, who'd suggested marriage might solve all her financial troubles inside of a single awkward supper. She knew what a performance sounded like by now. Ethan Calloway hadn't performed anything. He'd simply told her the truth and let her decide what to do with it. The homestead came into view as the sun tilted west, the small clapboard house Thomas had built with his own hands the summer before Mary was born, the barn leaning a little more to the left. Each year the fence line Ethan had mentioned sagging in 3 separate places where the posts had rotted through. It wasn't much. It had never been much, not compared to the Morrison spread or the other big outfits scattered across the county. But it was hers, bought and paid for in years of labor and love and grief, and she was not going to let Jedediah Crane take it from her without a fight, whatever shape that fight needed to take. She unhitched the wagon, settled Molly back in her pen, watched Mary run off to find the cat that lived in the hayloft, and stood alone for a moment in the yard, looking at the house that represented every hope she had left in the world. End of summer. She had perhaps 8 weeks, maybe 9, if the harvest ran late, to find a way to pay a note that had grown faster than her ability to earn against it, thanks to 2 seasons of failed crops, and a winter that had cost her 3 chickens and a good portion of her seed corn to a sickness she still didn't understand. 8 weeks to save a home her daughter had never known any other version of. 8 weeks, and a stranger's offer of help that came without a price tag. She could see which frightened her, more than an offer with a price tag would have, because at least a visible price could be measured and refused. Inside the house, she lit the stove and started supper. The same thin stew she'd been stretching for 3 days now, and she listened to Mary singing tunelessly to the barn cat through the open window, and she thought about Thursday. She thought about a man with storm-colored eyes standing in a town square, refusing to let a crowd of strangers turn her humiliation into their evening's entertainment, refusing to take a cow he'd rightfully paid for refusing to explain himself with anything less than the plain truth, even when a lie would have gone down easier. She did not know yet whether to trust him, but she knew, standing in her kitchen, with the last of her flour measured carefully into the pot, that she could not survive the next 8 weeks alone, and that pride, however hard-earned, was a poor substitute for a hand willing to mend a broken fence, for no reason but the wanting to make something right. Thursday came sooner than she expected, and later than she hoped, because in the 2 days between the auction and his promised return, Jedediah Crane sent a boy on horseback with a folded note that Clara read 3 times before the meaning of it fully settled into her bones. The bank, the note explained in Crane's careful, lawyerly hand, had discovered an irregularity in the original mortgage filing from 4 years past, an irregularity that might, upon review, accelerate the timeline of her obligation considerably. He regretted the inconvenience. He remained, as ever, her humble servant in these difficult matters. He would call upon her personally within the week to discuss the particulars. Clara set the note down on the kitchen table and sat very still. And when Mary asked what was wrong, she said only that the letter was grown-up business, and smiled the smile she had practiced for 4 years, and inside she felt something cold and certain settle into place. Whatever game Jedediah Crane was playing, he intended to win it before the harvest ever came in. and whatever Ethan Calloway wanted from her plain labor, or something else entirely, she was going to need every hand willing to fight on her side of the ledger, because she had a terrible feeling that 8 weeks was about to become considerably less than 8 weeks, and there would be no auction gavel left to save her the second time. She folded Crane's letter into a small square and tucked it behind the flour tin where Mary wouldn't find it, and she spent that night lying awake beside her daughter's small warm shape running numbers in her head that refused to come out anyway but short. When Thursday finally arrived gray and windless, she was out at the south fence line before the sun had fully cleared the barn roof, pulling rotted posts out of the dry ground with her bare hands because waiting for help felt too much like admitting she needed it. She heard the horse before she saw it and turned to find Ethan Calloway riding up the lane with a coil of new wire slung over his saddle and a sack of tools tied behind him, exactly as he'd said he would. "You're early," she said, because it was easier than saying anything else. "Figured a fence line that's been fighting somebody all summer deserves an early start." He swung down from his horse and looked at the 3 posts she'd already worked loose, then at her hands raw and dirt-streaked from the effort. "You could have waited on me, Mrs. Whitmore." "I don't wait well." "No," he said, and something in his mouth almost turned into a smile. "I don't imagine you do." They worked through the morning mostly in silence, Ethan setting new posts while Clara held them steady. Around midday, Mary came running out from the house with a jar of water and 2 biscuits wrapped in a cloth, and she planted herself on an overturned bucket to watch the proceedings with the serious attention of a foreman inspecting a job. "You're doing it wrong," she informed Ethan, pointing at the post he'd just set. "That's so. Papa used to tamp the dirt down harder. You're being too gentle with it." Something crossed Ethan's face quick and unreadable, and he crouched down and tamped the dirt down harder exactly as she'd said. "Better." Mary considered it with great seriousness. "Better. Your papa taught you well," Ethan said, and Clara felt something tighten in her chest that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite gratitude, because it had been a long time since anyone besides herself had spoken Thomas's memory out loud to their daughter without it turning into pity. "He knew everything about the ranch," Mary said. "Mama says he was the best rancher in the whole county. I believe it." Ethan straightened, wiped his hands on his trousers, and looked toward Clara, with something steady in his storm-colored eyes. "A man builds something worth keeping. It shows up in the people he leaves behind to keep it." Clara had to look away from him, then out toward the brown fields, and the fence line slowly mending itself post by post, because she was afraid of what her face might show him if she didn't. By the time the sun dropped low enough to paint the fields the color of old copper, the south fence stood straight and whole for the first time in 2 years. "I heard about Crane's letter," Ethan said, coiling the last of the leftover wire. "News travels fast in a town this size." "It's not your concern." "Maybe not. But I meant what I told you in the square, Mrs. Whitmore. I aim to help you keep this place. And if Crane's decided to move faster than the terms of your note allow, then we'd best start moving faster too." He tied off the wire and looked at her directly. "Whatever he's planning, ma'am, he's not planning it alone, and neither are you. Not anymore." Clara looked instead at her daughter chasing the barn cat through the long grass with the fence mended solid at her back, and she thought about 8 weeks narrowing toward something crueler, and she found for the first time since the letter arrived that she could breathe a little easier than she had the night before. "Thursday's fence is mended," she said finally. "I suppose that's a start." "It's a start," Ethan agreed, swinging back up into his saddle. "I'll be back before the week's out. There's more than one thing on this place that's been fighting you too long without help." He rode off down the lane as the light faded gold and then gray, and Clara stood at her mended fence with her daughter's hand finding hers in the dusk, and she did not yet know what Jedediah Crane intended or what it would cost her to find out. But she knew that whatever came next, she would not be facing it with empty hands anymore. Sunday came, the way Sundays always came in Valentine, with the church bell calling out over dry fields and every family in the county dressed in their least patched clothes, and Clara sat in the 4th pew from the back with Mary's hand in hers, feeling the weight of every eye that turned toward her and then quickly away, the way people looked at something they didn't want to be caught looking at. "They're staring, Mama," Mary whispered. "Let them stare." "Why are they staring?" "Because staring's easier than minding their own business, sweetheart. Sit still now." Mrs. Odell sat 2 pews up, and twice during the sermon, Clara caught her turning halfway around her eyes, sharp as a hawk's, cataloging every detail of Clara's plain gray dress and the tired set of her shoulders for later distribution over coffee cups. By the time the service ended and the congregation spilled out into the churchyard, the whispers had already found their rhythm low and constant as insects in tall grass. "Heard the Morrison Ranch hand's been out to her place twice this week," one woman murmured to another, not troubling herself to lower her voice enough. "Fence mending, they're calling it." "I'll bet." Clara kept walking, kept her chin level, kept Mary's hand firm in hers, because she had learned a long time ago that the only defense against a town's hunger for scandal was refusing to feed it with a reaction. She had almost made it to the wagon when Jedediah Crane's voice reached her from the church steps, pitched just loud enough to carry. "Mrs. Whitmore, a moment if you please. You—" She turned and found him descending the steps in his Sunday black hat in hand, wearing the particular smile he reserved for public performances of concern. "Mr. Crane, I trust you enjoyed the sermon. Reverend Hale does have a gift for reminding us of our obligations, doesn't he? Debts owed to the Lord, debts owed to our neighbors." He let the word debts hang in the air a beat longer than necessary. "I wonder if I might call on you tomorrow afternoon. There are some matters concerning your account that require discussion, and I'd rather handle them somewhere more private than a churchyard." "I have nothing to hide, Mr. Crane. You may say whatever you need to say right here." "I would prefer not to embarrass you in front of your neighbors, Mrs. Whitmore, given how tender feelings are running toward you already." His eyes flicked deliberately toward the cluster of gossiping women near the church door, and Clara understood the threat buried inside the courtesy as clearly as if he'd spoken it plain. "Tomorrow then, 2 o'clock. He didn't wait for her agreement. He replaced his hat and walked toward his carriage, and Clara stood there with her hands clenched at her sides, watching him go, feeling the particular helplessness of a woman who had just been told the time and place of her own reckoning, without being asked whether it suited her. Mary tugged her sleeve. "Mama, why does that man always make you sad?" "He doesn't make me sad, baby." "You get quiet when he talks. That's what you look like when you're sad." Clara didn't have an answer for that either, so she lifted her daughter up onto the wagon bench and said nothing at all, and the ride home passed in a silence that had nothing peaceful about it. Save for a single stop she'd meant to make at the feed store for flour and salt, before Mary's stomach reminded her supper couldn't be skipped 2 nights running. The bell above the feed store door rang thin and sharp when Clara pushed inside, and Otis Grant, who had run the counter there since before Mary was born, looked up from his ledger with an expression she'd never once seen him wear toward her. Before careful apologetic, unwilling to meet her eyes for more than a second at a time. "Afternoon, Mrs. Whitmore." "Afternoon, Otis. I'll need a sack of flour and a pound of salt, same as always, and I'm afraid it'll have to go on account again till the harvest comes in." Otis set down his pencil and rubbed at the back of his neck, and Clara felt her stomach drop before he'd even spoken another word, because she had learned to read that particular gesture in men who were about to disappoint her. "Mrs. Whitmore, I've got to be honest with you, and I'm sorrier about it than I know how to say plain. I can't extend your credit no further. Otis, I've kept an account here for 4 years. I've never once failed to settle it come harvest. I know it, ma'am, and it pains me something fierce to say otherwise. But Mr. Crane holds the note on this store same as he holds yours, and he sent word yesterday that any account carrying a balance past 30 days was to be closed out effective immediate. Yours is the only account he named particular." Otis's face had gone the color of old paper, ashamed of himself in a way that told Clara he understood exactly what game was being played, and hated his own part in it. "I've got a family to feed too, Mrs. Whitmore. I can't cross him not with my own note hanging over my head the same as yours is." "Then I'll pay cash." Clara counted out coins from the small purse she kept for emergencies, coins that had been meant to stretch considerably further than 1 sack of flour, and set them on the counter with hands that refused to shake, no matter how badly she wanted them to. "There, cash money same as anyone else. Otis took it, clearly relieved to have an honest transaction to complete instead of a difficult refusal to deliver, and wrapped her flower with more care than the task strictly required, as though the gentleness of his hands might make up for what his mouth had just been forced to say. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Whitmore, truly. If there was another way—" "There isn't, Otis. I understand. You've a family same as I do." Clara took her parcel and turned to leave, and at the door she paused, looking back at a man who had sold her family flour and salt and sugar for 4 years without ever once making her feel small for needing credit to do it. "You tell Mr. Crane if he asks that I paid in full and in cash, and that I'll be back next week to do the same, however long he intends to keep squeezing this town on my account." She walked out with her chin high and her purse considerably lighter than it had been an hour before, and by the time she climbed back onto the wagon, Mary was watching her with the particular solemnity of a child who understood without being told the specifics that something had gone wrong inside that store. "Mama, are we going to be hungry?" "No, sweetheart. We've got flour for now, and I'll find a way to get more when we need it." "Promise." "I promise." Clara snapped the reins and didn't let herself think too hard about whether it was a promise she could actually keep, because a mother learned early that some promises had to be made on faith alone, stitched together out of stubbornness and love, rather than any certainty of the road ahead. Monday morning brought Ethan before it brought Crane, which Clara counted as the only mercy the day seemed willing to offer. He rode up the lane just past sunrise with a ladder lashed to the side of his horse, and when Clara came out onto the porch, he was already unloading it against the side of the house. "Roof's got a soft patch over the kitchen," he said by way of greeting. "Noticed it dripping through your ceiling boards Thursday. Figured I'd fix it before the next rain finds it first. Mr. Calloway, you don't need to keep—" "I told you I would, Mrs. Whitmore. A man who doesn't keep his word about a roof isn't likely to keep it about anything bigger. And I'd rather you know now what kind of man you're dealing with." He set the ladder against the eave and looked at her, something careful in his expression, like he could read some of what had happened at church without being told. "Something troubling you this morning. Crane's calling on me this afternoon, 2 o'clock. She hadn't meant to tell him. It came out anyway the way things did when a person had been carrying a weight alone too long, and finally found someone willing to help hold it. "Some matter concerning my account," he says. Something flickered across Ethan's face, quick and hard gone before she could name it fully. "You want me here when he comes." "I don't think that would help matters. A widow entertaining a ranch hand at her home, while a banker calls to discuss her finances. I can already hear what Mrs. Odell would make of that. Let her make what she wants of it." His jaw had set in a way she was beginning to recognize the look of a man deciding something and not much caring for outside opinion once he had. "But I understand your thinking. I'll finish this roof and be gone before noon. If you need me after you send Mary running for me, and I'll be back inside the hour whatever Crane says or thinks about it. You'd come running for a widow's summons. That's not going to help the talk either. Mrs. Whitmore." He said it plainly without heat, the way he seemed to say most things that mattered to him. "I don't much care what this town talks about. I care what happens to you and that little girl. Those aren't the same concern, and I'd ask you not to confuse them on my account." Clara didn't know what to say to that, so she went inside and let him work, and through the morning she listened to the rhythm of his hammer overhead, steady and unhurried, and found it strangely comforting. The sound of someone fixing something in her life without being asked twice or expecting to be thanked for it. He was gone by 11, as promised. The roof patched and the kitchen dry, and Clara spent the hour before Crane's arrival scrubbing the table and straightening the few decent chairs she owned, not because she wanted to impress him, but because she refused to let him see her home in disarray, refused to give him one more thing to hold against her. Crane arrived precisely at 2, driving his own carriage, rather than sending a boy, which told Clara before he said a single word that whatever business he'd come to discuss mattered enough to him personally that he didn't trust it to a messenger. He came inside without waiting to be asked, settled himself at her kitchen table, like he owned it, and opened a leather folder thick with papers. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'll come straight to it since I know you've little patience for pleasantries these days." He spread 3 documents across her table, each one covered in the small, cramped handwriting of legal clerks. "In reviewing your account this past week, I discovered some troubling irregularities. It seems your late husband in the year before his passing took out a second note against this property to cover certain debts at the feed store and with Dr. Ashworth. That note was never properly recorded with the county. Clara felt the floor tilt beneath her, though she remained perfectly still. I know nothing of any second note. I imagine you don't. Thomas kept his own counsel on such matters from what I understand. Crane's voice carried a gentleness that made the words worse, not better the sympathy of a man who had rehearsed exactly how much softness to apply to a blade before it went in. The debt exists regardless of your knowledge of it, Mrs. Whitmore. $81 plus 4 years of accrued interest, which brings the total to something closer to $130. That's impossible. I've never seen a bill from Dr. Ashworth for such a sum. The bill was for Thomas's care in his final illness. I imagine grief made certain financial details slip past your attention at the time, which is entirely understandable. He said it kindly, almost gently, and Clara wanted to throw the coffee pot at his head for the particular cruelty of that gentleness. The point remains, Mrs. Whitmore, that this debt is now attached to your primary note, which means your obligation to the bank has grown considerably beyond what we discussed at the auction. How much? With the original mortgage balance, the newly discovered second note, and accrued interest on both, your total obligation now stands at $412. He said the number the way a man reads a weather report, flat and unremarkable, though Clara heard it land in her chest like a stone dropped down a well. Do as we agreed by the end of summer. You've doubled what I owe you in the space of a week. I haven't doubled anything, Mrs. Whitmore. I've simply discovered debts that already existed. I understand this is difficult to hear, and I take no pleasure in delivering it. He folded his hands on the table, and for a moment, Clara thought she saw something almost like genuine regret pass behind his eyes, before it hardened back into calculation. There is, however, another path available to you, one I raise only out of genuine concern for your circumstances. I'm listening. I could forgive the second note entirely, wipe it clean along with a substantial portion of the interest on the original mortgage, reducing your total obligation to something quite manageable. He let the offer sit in the air a moment before continuing, and Clara felt her stomach clench in anticipation of whatever came next. In exchange for your hand in marriage. The silence that followed felt like it lasted an hour, though it could only have been seconds. Clara stared at him, certain she had misheard, though the steady, unblinking way he watched her told her she hadn't. You're asking me to marry you. I'm offering you a solution to a problem that has no other clean solution, Mrs. Whitmore. I'm a man of considerable means, as you well know. Your daughter would want for nothing. Your land would be secure. Your reputation, which I understand is already suffering thanks to certain recent visitors, would be restored to respectability. He said it all so reasonably, so calmly, like he was offering to fix a fence rather than purchase a wife. I understand this is sudden. I don't require an answer today. Clara stood up from the table so quickly, her chair scraped hard against the floorboards. Get out of my house. Mrs. Whitmore, you manufactured a debt out of thin air, and then offered me marriage as the cure for a disease you invented yourself, and you expect me to thank you for the generosity of it. Her voice had risen, shaking now with something closer to fury than fear. Get out of my house, Mr. Crane, before I forget every manner my mother ever taught me. Crane rose slowly, unhurried, gathering his papers back into their folder. With the same careful precision, he did everything. I understand this is a great deal to absorb in one sitting. I'll leave you to consider it. But I would ask you to think carefully, Mrs. Whitmore, about pride and what it's cost you already, and what it stands to cost your daughter before this summer ends. He paused at the door, hat in hand. $412 by summer's end. That figure doesn't change whether you marry me or not. Only your ability to pay it does. He left, and Clara stood alone in her kitchen with her hands braced against the table, breathing hard, feeling the walls of her home press in around her like they'd shrunk 2 sizes in the span of a single conversation. She didn't cry. She had promised herself years ago she wouldn't cry in this kitchen, because Mary's room shared a wall thin enough to carry sound, and a mother's tears had a way of teaching a child fear faster than any spoken words could. She sent for Ethan an hour later exactly as he'd told her to, and he arrived at a gallop that told her he'd been watching the road since he left. What happened? Clara told him everything: the second note, the inflated sum the marriage proposal delivered like a business transaction, and watched his face darken with each detail, until by the end his jaw had gone tight enough that a muscle jumped visibly beneath his skin. He fabricated that debt. I can't prove that. I can. Ethan's voice had dropped into something low and dangerous, a register Clara hadn't heard from him before. Dr. Ashworth's been dead 3 years, Mrs. Whitmore. Died the same winter your husband did. Any bill Crane's claiming came from him would have had to be filed with the county before Ashworth passed, and county records don't just misplace themselves for 4 years running, unless somebody's paying them not to remember. You think Crane bribed the county recorder. I think Crane's done worse than that to men who owed him less than you do. Something old and bitter moved behind his eyes, and Clara realized she was finally about to hear the thing he'd been circling since the auction, the mistake he'd said he regretted every day since. 3 years ago, my father held a note with this same bank on a smaller spread about 40 miles east of here. Crane found an irregularity in that note too same as he's found in yours. Said my father owed back taxes on land improvements that had never been properly filed. Doubled what my father owed inside of 2 months. What happened? My father couldn't pay it. Crane took the land. Ethan's voice had gone flat, controlled in the particular way of a man keeping a much larger feeling locked down tight. I was working a cattle drive down in Texas when it happened. Didn't get word until it was already done. By the time I made it home, my father had moved into a boarding house in town, and my mother had died of a fever inside of a year, and I've always believed the loss of that land had something to do with hastening it, though there's no way to prove a thing like that in any court. Ethan? She hadn't used his given name before. It slipped out now, unplanned, carried on a wave of understanding that reframed everything he'd told her since the auction. That's why you stepped forward that day. It was never really about me. It started that way, maybe. I saw a man about to do to you exactly what he did to my father, and something in me couldn't stand by and watch it happen twice. He met her eyes steady, despite whatever storm was moving behind them. But it isn't just about that anymore, Mrs. Whitmore. Hasn't been for a while now, if I'm being honest with you the way you've been honest with me. Clara felt something shift in her chest, warm and frightening in equal measure, and she pushed it down hard because there wasn't room in her life right now for anything but survival. We need proof. If Crane did to your father what he's doing to me, there has to be a pattern, something the county can't ignore if we bring it to the right person. County recorder's in Crane's pocket. That's most likely how he's getting away with it in the first place. Then we go above this county, to the territorial land office or a lawyer out of Omaha who doesn't answer to Crane's money. Clara felt something steady settling into her, now a plan forming out of the wreckage of the afternoon, and it felt better than despair, even if it was no less frightening. I have $412 I don't have and won't have by summer's end, regardless of what we do. But if we can prove that debt is fabricated, prove there's a pattern, maybe we can stop him from taking this land the way he took your father's. That's a considerable maybe. It's the only maybe I've got left, Mr. Calloway. Something almost like a smile touched the corner of his mouth, brief and tired. Ethan, if we're going to fight a man like Crane together, seems foolish to keep standing on ceremony about names. Ethan, she repeated, and found she liked the shape of it in her mouth more than she was entirely comfortable admitting. They spent the rest of that afternoon at her kitchen table, the same table Crane had spread his fabricated documents across only hours before working out what pieces of proof might exist and where to find them. Ethan knew the name of the clerk who'd handled his father's foreclosure, a man named Pruitt, who'd since moved to a town 30 miles south after a falling out with the county that Ethan had never gotten the full story on. If Pruitt could be found, and if he could be persuaded to talk, there might be a paper trail connecting Crane's pattern of manufactured debts to more families than just the Calloways and the Whitmores. What happened to your mother exactly? Clara asked, gently aware she was asking him to walk back into something painful. You said the loss of the land hastened her passing. You don't have to tell me if it's too much. Ethan was quiet for a moment, turning his hat over in his hands, the way men did when they needed something to occupy their fingers while their mind worked through harder terrain. She never said much about it directly, wasn't her way to complain, but she'd built that house with my father, with her own 2 hands, same as your husband built this one, and I think losing it broke something in her that never quite mended right. She caught a fever that winter that a stronger woman might have shaken off easy enough. I've always believed the land had something to do with why she didn't. I'm sorry, Ethan. Don't be sorry on my account. Be angry on your own. He looked up at her, something fierce and protective in his expression. That's why I mean to see this through properly, Clara. Not just proof enough to save your place, but proof enough to see he never does this to another family again. I'll ride out to find him, Ethan said. Take me 2 days there and back if the weather holds. 2 days is 2 days closer to summer's end. I know it, but 2 days spent chasing proof beats, 8 weeks spent waiting for Crane to finish burying you in paper you can't fight without something solid to fight back with. He stood gathering his hat from where he'd set it on her table. I'll leave at first light. You'll be all right here till I'm back. I've been all right alone for 4 years, Mr. Calloway. Ethan. She corrected herself before he could. I imagine 2 more days won't undo me. No, he said, studying her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. I don't imagine it would. But that doesn't mean I like leaving you to face this alone, ma'am. You're not leaving me alone. You're going to get proof that might save both our families from the same man. That's not abandonment, Ethan. That's the opposite of it. All the same, he said, pausing at the door with his hand on the frame. If Crane comes around while I'm gone, you send Mary running to the Odell place not to face him alone. Promise me that much. I promise. I mean it, Clara. I heard you the first time, Ethan Calloway. I'm not a woman who breaks a promise I've made out loud. Something almost like a smile passed between them, then brief but real, the kind of small warmth that could survive even a conversation as heavy as the one they'd just had. He left at dawn the next morning, and Clara spent the 2 days that followed in a state of suspended waiting that made every ordinary task feel like it was happening to someone else at some distance from her own body. She milked Molly and fed the chickens and mended Mary's torn pinafore and swept a kitchen that didn't need sweeping, and every time she heard hoofbeats on the lane, her heart leapt before she remembered it was too soon for him to be back. Mary noticed her mother's distraction, the way children always noticed more than adults gave them credit for, and on the first evening as Clara sat by the lamp pretending to mend a stocking she'd already mended twice, Mary climbed into her lap, uninvited, and pressed her small face against Clara's collarbone. Is Mr. Ethan coming back? Of course he is, sweetheart. He said 2 days. But what if that mean man does something to him like he does to us? Clara felt her heart clench at the plain, unguarded fear in her daughter's voice. The fear of a child who had already learned far too young that grown men in this world sometimes did terrible things to people who couldn't fight back. Mr. Ethan can look after himself, baby. He's not like us. He's got no debt for Mr. Crane to threaten him with, and he's strong enough to handle whatever trouble comes his way. You're strong too, Mama. I try to be. Then why are you scared? Clara didn't have a ready answer for that, because the honest one that strength and fear could live in the same chest at the same time that a woman could be both felt too large and complicated to hand to a 4-year-old at bedtime. Being strong doesn't mean never being scared, Mary. It just means doing what needs doing anyway, scared or not. Now off to bed with you. Morning comes early. She tucked her daughter in and sat by the window a long while after watching the dark road for a rider who wasn't due yet, and thinking about all the ways Jedediah Crane had already reached into her home without ever setting foot past her porch, the feed store, the fabricated debt, the whispered rumors, and now apparently her own daughter's nightmares. On the second evening, as the sun dropped low, and Clara had nearly convinced herself something had gone wrong, she heard a rider approaching at speed faster than a returning traveler usually came, and she stepped out onto the porch with her heart in her throat, half expecting bad news before she'd even confirmed who it was. It was Ethan, and even from the distance of the lane, she could see something urgent in the way he rode, and by the time he swung down from his horse breathing hard, She knew before he spoke a word that whatever he'd found had changed the shape of everything. "I found Pruitt." And he talked plenty once I convinced him Crane's reach didn't extend as far south as he'd been telling himself it did. Ethan pulled a folded envelope from inside his coat thick with pages and pressed it into her hands. "My father's foreclosure. 2 other families besides mine going back 6 years. Same pattern every time a manufactured debt discovered right when a man's already struggling. Always just enough to push him past what he can pay. Always with the same suggestion attached that there might be another way to settle it besides cash. Another way. Pruitt says Crane's done this 3 times before with widows specifically. Offered marriage in exchange for forgiving invented debt. 2 of them said yes." Ethan's voice had gone hard as stone. "One of them said no, same as you did, and lost her land inside a month, same as my father did." Clara opened the envelope with shaking hands and found copies of documents Pruitt had apparently kept squirreled away for years' insurance against a day when Crane's reach finally caught up to him, 2 records of altered mortgage filings and backdated debts that told a story far uglier than anything Clara had imagined, even at her most frightened. "This is enough," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This has to be enough. It's enough to bring to a territorial judge if we can find one who isn't already bought." Ethan looked at her, something urgent and unguarded in his expression that hadn't been there before, like the ride south had stripped away some final layer of caution he'd been carrying. "But Crane won't sit still once he learns Pruitt's talked. If word gets back to him that we've got proof, he'll move faster than we can, and I don't know what shape that moving will take." As if summoned by the very mention of his name, they heard a second set of hoofbeats on the lane, slower and more deliberate than Ethan's had been. And Clara felt her stomach drop as she recognized Jedediah Crane's carriage rolling toward the house in the gathering dusk, flanked, she realized, with a fresh jolt of alarm by the county sheriff riding alongside it. "Ethan," she said, low and urgent, "put that envelope somewhere he won't find it. Now." He moved fast, tucking the papers behind a loose board in the porch step that Clara hadn't even known was loose. And by the time Crane's carriage rolled to a stop in her yard, both of them stood composed, or as composed as 2 people could manage, with their hearts hammering, facing a man who smiled like he already knew he'd won something. "Mrs. Whitmore?" Crane tipped his hat, then turned his attention deliberately to Ethan, his smile sharpening. "Mr. Calloway. How convenient to find you here at this hour. Sheriff Dunmore has some questions he'd like to put to you both if you don't mind." The sheriff dismounted an older man with a tired face and eyes that seemed to apologize for his errand before he'd even spoken. "Mrs. Whitmore, I've received a complaint alleging improper conduct at this residence. Unmarried man-widow, living alone, visits at all hours. The complaint suggests the arrangement's been going on for some time and raises questions about your fitness to maintain guardianship of your daughter." Clara felt the ground tilt beneath her a second time that week, worse than the first, because this was no longer about money or land. This was about Mary, about the one thing in her life that mattered more than any homestead or any debt. "That complaint is a lie," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Mr. Calloway has been here to mend fences and repair my roof in plain daylight with my daughter present every time. There has been nothing improper about a single visit." "I'm sure that's true, ma'am," Sheriff Dunmore said, not unkindly, "but a complaint's been filed all the same, and it's my job to look into it, whatever the truth turns out to be." "And who filed this complaint, Sheriff?" Ethan's voice had gone dangerously quiet, the same register Clara had heard when he first spoke of his father. "The complaint came in anonymous Mr. Calloway." "Did it?" Ethan turned his gaze on Crane, who met it without flinching, his expression arranged into something like sympathetic concern. "Funny thing, an anonymous complaint arriving the same day I ride back into town with information that might trouble a certain banker's business dealings." "I'm sure I don't know what you mean," Crane said smoothly. "I only heard the rumors circulating in town, same as everyone else, and thought it my civic duty to see that a child's welfare was properly looked after. Nothing more sinister than that, Mr. Calloway, whatever you're implying." "Sheriff," Clara said, fighting to keep her voice level, "I would like to know what happens now. What this complaint means for my daughter. Sheriff Dunmore rubbed at the back of his neck, clearly uncomfortable with the whole business. For now, ma'am, nothing happens beyond what I've already told you. I've looked into it. I've spoken with you both, and I've seen nothing here tonight that troubles me. But I'll be honest with you, if a formal petition gets filed with the circuit judge questioning your fitness as a guardian, that's a different matter entirely, one that would require a hearing. And who would file such a petition? Ethan asked, though the question was clearly rhetorical, aimed less at the sheriff than at the man standing beside him. Anyone with standing in the community and genuine concern for the child's welfare, Crane said, could theoretically bring such a matter before the court. I would hope it never comes to that, of course. I would hope Mrs. Whitmore might see reason before matters progress that far. The threat sat in the yard between them unmistakable despite its polite dressing, and Clara understood with sudden sickening clarity exactly what Crane had constructed here, not just a financial trap, but a second one layered beneath it, aimed not at her land, but at the one thing she would sacrifice anything to protect. "I need to speak with you privately, Mr. Crane," she said. "Away from the sheriff, away from Mr. Calloway, just the two of us. Mrs. Whitmore." Ethan started alarm plain in his voice, but she cut him off with a look that asked him to trust her, though she wasn't entirely certain yet what she intended to do with whatever privacy she managed to secure. Crane's smile widened. Satisfied, certain he'd finally cornered her into the conversation he'd wanted all along. "Of course, Mrs. Whitmore. Sheriff Mr. Calloway, if you'll give us a moment." They walked a short distance from the house out toward the fence line Ethan had mended, and once they were out of easy earshot, Clara turned on Crane with a fury she'd kept carefully banked all evening. "You filed that complaint yourself." "I filed nothing, Mrs. Whitmore. I merely responded to concerns already circulating." His composure hadn't cracked at all, and that more than anything told Clara how thoroughly he'd planned this moment. "But I'll be plain with you, since plain speaking seems to be the fashion these days. You have a choice in front of you. Marry me, settle your debt, and this entire unpleasant business with the sheriff disappears as quickly as it appeared. Refuse, and I cannot promise what shape the coming weeks will take for you or for your daughter. You'd use a child as leverage to force a woman into marriage. I would use whatever tools were available to secure an outcome I believe would benefit everyone involved. Mrs. Whitmore, including you, whether you're capable of seeing that clearly right now or not." For just a moment, something flickered behind his careful mask, something that might have been genuine belief in his own justification, which frightened Clara more than open malice would have. "I am not a monster. I am a man who has watched you struggle for 4 years and would like to see that struggle end on terms that happen to also suit my own interests. Is that so different from any marriage arranged for practical reasons throughout history? It's different because I don't want you, Mr. Crane. Not your money, not your name, not the false safety you're offering in exchange for my daughter's future and my own dignity. Dignity doesn't keep a roof over a child's head, Mrs. Whitmore." His voice had cooled several degrees, the courtesy finally beginning to fray at its edges. "Neither does a ranch hand's savings, however gallant his intentions. You have until the Harvest Festival 3 weeks from now to give me your answer. Marry me, and every debt, every threat, every complaint disappears as though it never existed. Refuse, and I promise you a fight considerably uglier than anything you've faced from me so far." He walked back towards his carriage without waiting for her response, exchanged a few quiet words with Sheriff Dunmore that Clara couldn't hear, and rode off into the gathering dark, leaving her standing alone at the fence line with her heart pounding, and her hands she realized clenched so tightly that her nails had left small crescents in her palms. Sheriff Dunmore approached her gently before he mounted his own horse. "Mrs. Whitmore, for whatever it's worth, I don't like the smell of any of this. I'll be watching how it unfolds. You have my word on that much, if nothing else." "Thank you, Sheriff." He rode off after Crane and Ethan crossed the yard to where Clara stood, his face tight with barely contained anger. "What did he say to you?" Clara told him every word of it. The ultimatum. The deadline of the Harvest Festival. The threat wrapped inside a marriage proposal, wrapped inside a manufactured crisis, and watched Ethan's expression darken further with each detail, until finally something in him seemed to snap taut like a rope pulled past its limit. "I'll kill him," You will not. Clara, you will not. She repeated more firmly, using his first name deliberately to pull him back from whatever edge he'd stepped toward. A dead banker helps nobody, least of all you, swinging from a rope for murder, while my daughter grows up with both the people who might have protected her gone from her life entirely. We fight this with proof, Ethan, not with violence. That's the only fight that ends with both of us still standing at the end of it. He exhaled slowly, visibly, working to master whatever fury had gripped him, and when he spoke again, his voice had steadied, though something hard remained beneath it. 3 weeks. 3 weeks to get that evidence in front of a judge who isn't bought and hope it moves fast enough to matter before the harvest festival arrives. Clara looked toward the house where she could see Mary's small shape, silhouetted in the window, having watched the whole exchange from behind the glass, despite every instruction to stay inside. 3 weeks to prove he's done this before to enough families that a judge has to take notice before he can make good on destroying what's left of mine. And if we can't find a judge in time... Clara didn't answer that question right away because the honest answer frightened her more than she wanted to admit out loud. Standing in her own yard in the dark with her daughter watching from the window, and a man beside her who had already lost everything once to the same enemy circling her now. Then I suppose I'll have a choice to make, she said finally, same as he intends for me to have. But I'd rather spend these 3 weeks fighting for a better choice than the one he's offering Ethan. Whatever it costs us to try. Ethan looked at her for a long moment in the dark, and something passed between them that neither of them named aloud. Something that had been building quietly through fence lines, mended, and roofs patched, and a stranger's confession delivered plain across a kitchen table. And when he finally spoke, his voice had dropped low and rough, with a feeling he seemed to be fighting to keep contained. Whatever choice you make, Clara Whitmore, I intend to still be standing beside you when you make it. That's not charity, and it isn't a bargain either. It's just the truth of where I've landed somewhere between that auction and tonight, and I thought you ought to know it plain the same as everything else I've told you. Clara felt something crack open in her chest, some door she'd kept bolted since Thomas died, and for one dangerous moment, she let herself imagine what it might feel like to step through it to close the small distance still standing between them in the dark, and let a man's steadiness carry some of what she'd been carrying alone for 4 years. She saw something answer that thought in his eyes, too. Some matching hunger quickly checked, and neither of them moved because both of them understood without needing to say it that whatever stood between them deserved better than being built on the wreckage of a threat and a deadline. I can't, she said quietly, though it cost her something to say it. Not tonight. Not with everything hanging the way it is. If I let myself want anything more than surviving this right now, Ethan, I'm afraid I'll lose the nerve to fight it clean. I understand. And she believed that he did that whatever he felt hadn't blinded him to what she needed most in that moment, which was space enough to be afraid without also being asked to be brave about her own heart at the same time. I'm not asking you for anything tonight, Clara. Just telling you where I stand, so you're not guessing at it while you're deciding everything else. Go on home, Ethan, she said instead, though her voice had softened considerably from where it started. Get some rest. We've got a fight ahead of us, and I mean to face it with a clear head come morning. He nodded, understanding what she hadn't said as much as what she had, and mounted his horse. But before he rode off, he looked back at her one final time. 3 weeks, Clara. We'll find a way through it. He rode off into the dark, and Clara stood alone in her yard beneath a sky full of hard, indifferent stars, thinking about harvest festivals and manufactured debts, and a man's steady voice telling her he intended to stay, and she did not yet know whether 3 weeks would be enough time to save everything she loved. But she knew for the first time since the auctioneer's gavel had come down weeks before that she no longer intended to face whatever came next, standing entirely alone. The letter arrived on the 9th day, carried by a rider who'd come all the way from the territorial capital, and Clara's hands shook so badly opening it that Mary had to steady the envelope against the table for her. What's it say, Mama? Clara read it twice before she trusted herself to speak the words aloud. Judge Harmon Whitfield will hear the matter of fraudulent lending practices against Jedediah Crane pending review of submitted evidence. A date will be set upon completion of preliminary review. Is that good? It's good. Clara pressed the letter flat against her chest, like she could push the words directly into her heart to make them more real. It's the first good thing that's happened to us in weeks, sweetheart. She rode out to the Morrison spread that same afternoon to find Ethan, something she'd never done before, always waiting instead for him to come to her. But the letter felt too important to sit on until his next visit. He was mending a stretch of corral fence when she arrived, and the look on his face when he saw her riding up unannounced told her he'd already guessed something significant had happened. Clara, everything all right? A judge has agreed to hear the case. Judge Harmon Whitfield, out of the territorial capital. She dismounted before her horse had fully stopped, too impatient to wait. He wants to review the evidence first, but Ethan, he's agreed to hear it. That has to mean something. Something in Ethan's face broke open with a relief so plain and unguarded that Clara felt her own chest tighten watching it. That's the first crack of daylight we've had since Crane started this whole business. There's no date set yet, just a promise of review. A promise of review from a judge who isn't in Crane's pocket is worth more than 100 promises from anybody in this county right now. He set down his hammer and crossed the corral to where she stood. And for a moment, neither of them said anything at all, just stood close enough that Clara could feel the warmth coming off him in the afternoon sun. How much time before the harvest festival? 12 days. Then we've got 12 days to hope Whitfield moves faster than Crane can maneuver around him. Ethan's jaw tightened, some old wariness surfacing beneath the hope. Crane's not a man who sits still once he smells trouble coming. You can be sure he's already got Whitfield's name written somewhere on a list of problems that need solving. You think he'd try to bribe a territorial judge? I think Crane's tried worse things for smaller stakes than what he stands to lose if Whitfield rules against him. Ethan looked toward the horizon, toward Valentine sitting somewhere beyond the fields, and something hardened in his expression. We need to get word to Whitfield's office before Crane does. Make sure he understands the urgency, the harvest festival deadline, everything at stake, if this drags past that date. I'll write to him myself. Tonight. I'll ride the letter out personally. Faster than trusting it to the regular post, and I don't aim to let anything about this case sit in a mailbag where Crane's people might get curious about its contents. Clara nodded already, composing the letter in her mind, and found herself studying Ethan's face in the afternoon light. The set of his jaw, the careful way he'd started weighing every decision, now against the shadow of a man neither of them had asked to be fighting. Thank you, Ethan, for all of it. I don't think I've said that plainly enough. You don't need to thank me, Clara. Not for this. Something softer moved behind his eyes, quickly covered, but not quickly enough that she missed it. I told you once I meant to see this through properly. That hasn't changed, just because it's costing more than either of us expected. It's costing you too. Time you could be spending at the Morrison Ranch earning wages instead of chasing letters and clerks on my account. Morrison understands. Told me himself he'd rather lose a hand for a few weeks than watch Crane finish what he started with my father. This time against a woman who never did anything to deserve it. Ethan's mouth tightened briefly. Besides, some things are worth more than wages, Clara. I stopped counting the cost of this particular fight somewhere around the second time I watched you hold your chin up in front of that whole town square. She wrote the letter that night by lamplight, careful and precise, and Ethan rode out with it before dawn. And for 3 days after that, the waiting stretched thin and taut, as wire pulled too tight. Every hour weighed against the calendar, against a festival now looming 10 days out, then 9, then 8. On the 4th day, Mrs. Odell arrived at Clara's door uninvited, which had never once happened in 4 years of neighboring, and Clara opened it warily, bracing herself for whatever fresh cruelty the woman had come to deliver. Mrs. Odell, I'll not stay long, Clara. The older woman stood stiffly on the porch, her hands twisting the strap of her handbag, and something in her expression looked almost sheepish, an emotion Clara had never once seen cross that particular face. I've come to say I heard talk in town today about Crane's dealings, about a judge looking into fraud claims against the bank. News travels fast, faster than usual because Crane himself is the one making sure everybody hears it, though not the way you'd expect. Mrs. Odell's mouth thinned into a hard line. He's telling folks you and that ranch hand cooked up false accusations against him out of spite because he refused to extend your credit further. Says you're trying to ruin an honest businessman's reputation to cover your own failure to pay what you owe. Clara felt something cold settle in her stomach. That's a lie. I don't doubt it is. I've done business with Jedediah Crane for 15 years. Clara and I've watched him ruin 3 families in that time who never seemed near so careless with money as he claimed. Mrs. Odell's chin lifted, some old stubbornness surfacing that Clara had never associated with the woman's endless gossip before. I came to tell you I don't believe his story, whatever I might have said about you and that man visiting your fence lines. A woman's entitled to fight for what's hers, and I've decided I'd rather be wrong about you than complicit in whatever he's building against you. Clara stood in her doorway, momentarily too surprised to answer, watching a woman she'd counted among her harshest critics stand there offering something that looked against all odds like an apology dressed up as gossip. Thank you, Mrs. Odell. That means more than you know. Don't thank me yet. I've only told you what I heard, not fixed anything. Mrs. Odell turned to go, then paused at the porch steps, looking back with an expression Clara couldn't quite read. For what it's worth, my sister lost her farm to a banknote 20 years back, before I ever came to Valentine. I know what it looks like when a man decides a woman's desperation is his to profit from. I should have remembered that sooner than I did. Why didn't you, if you knew what it looked like? Mrs. Odell was quiet a moment, her hands still worrying at the strap of her handbag. Because it's easier to judge a woman's misfortune than to remember your own family once stood exactly where she's standing. I'm not proud of it, Clara, but there it is, plain as you asked for it. She left before Clara could respond further, and Clara stood in her doorway a long while afterward, turning over the strange gift of an unexpected ally, however small, however late it had arrived. Ethan returned from delivering the letter with news that Judge Whitfield's clerk had confirmed receipt and promised a preliminary hearing date within the week, and for 2 days the hope of it carried Clara through chores and worry alike, right up until the morning. Sheriff Dunmore rode up her lane with an expression that told her before he'd said a single word that whatever news he carried wouldn't be good. Mrs. Whitmore, I'm sorry to trouble you again. What's happened, Sheriff? A formal petition's been filed with the circuit court, questioning your fitness as Mary's guardian. He said it carefully, like a man handling something that might shatter if he moved too fast. Filed by Jedediah Crane, this time under his own name, no more hiding behind anonymous complaints. Cites concerns about, and I'm reading his words here, not my own, unmarried male visitors of questionable character frequenting your home, along with financial instability that he claims endangers the child's welfare. That's outrageous. Ethan's done nothing but help me. I believe you, ma'am. But a hearing's been scheduled all the same to determine if there's cause for further investigation. Circuit judge is coming through in 10 days, same week as your harvest festival, as it happens. Sheriff Dunmore's mouth tightened with what looked like genuine distaste for his own errand. I'll be honest with you, Mrs. Whitmore. I don't like the timing of any of this. Feels calculated to me, though I can't prove a man's motives in a courtroom, only his actions. 10 days. Clara felt the number land like a stone in her chest, stacking on top of the harvest festival deadline, on top of everything else Crane had built to crush her beneath at once. That's the same week Crane expects an answer about his marriage proposal. I didn't know about any proposal, ma'am, but I can't say I'm surprised to hear it given everything else I've seen. Sheriff Dunmore shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. For what it's worth, I intend to attend that guardianship hearing myself and speak to what I've personally witnessed at this property, which is a woman raising her daughter proper and a man mending fences and roofs in plain daylight, nothing more sinister than that. Thank you, Sheriff. Don't thank me yet, Mrs. Whitmore. Circuit judges don't always listen to sheriffs, same as they listen to bankers with money to spread around. He tipped his hat and rode off, and Clara stood in her yard with the weight of 2 deadlines now converging on the same terrible week. Feeling something close to despair creeping in at the edges of the hope she'd been nursing since Whitfield's letter arrived, she sent for Ethan, and when he heard the news, his face went through several expressions in quick succession. Shock, then fury, then something more controlled and calculating that Clara had come to recognize as the look of a man building a strategy out of bad news. He's trying to collapse everything into the same week. The marriage deadline, the guardianship hearing, all of it stacked together, so you've got no room left to breathe or think clearly before you're forced to choose. It's working. It's not working, Clara. Not yet. He took her hands in his unplanned urgent, and neither of them pulled away from the contact despite every reason caution might have offered. We've got Whitfield reviewing the fraud evidence. We've got Sheriff Dunmore willing to speak on our behalf at the guardianship hearing. We've got Mrs. Odell, of all people, softening toward you instead of against you. Crane's trying to bury us in timing, because timing's the only weapon he's got left that doesn't require proof. And if Whitfield's hearing doesn't happen before the guardianship hearing, if the judge in that courtroom decides Mary's better off somewhere else with someone Crane's arranged while all this gets sorted out. Ethan's grip on her hands tightened, and something raw crossed his face. That won't happen. You can't promise me that. No, he admitted. I can't. But I can promise you I'll be standing in that courtroom beside you, fighting with everything I've got, same as I've fought since that auction. Whatever Crane's built, we tear it down piece by piece, Clara. That's the only promise I've got worth making. She believed him in that moment more completely than she'd let herself believe anything since Thomas died, and something in that belief frightened her almost as much as it steadied her, because trusting a man that fully meant risking a grief she wasn't certain she could survive twice in one lifetime. That night, after Ethan had ridden home, Clara found Mary sitting up in bed instead of asleep, her small face troubled in the lamplight. Mama, is that judge going to take me away? Clara sat down on the edge of the bed, careful to keep her voice steady, even as her heart broke a little at the question. No, sweetheart. Nobody's taking you anywhere. I promise you that. But the sheriff said there's a hearing about whether you're a good enough mother. There's a hearing about whether Mr. Crane's telling the truth, which he isn't, and whether the judge believes him, which I don't think he will, not once he hears what really happened. Clara smoothed Mary's hair back from her forehead, the same gesture she'd used 100 times before, to ease a frightened child toward sleep. You are the most important thing in my whole world, Mary Whitmore, and I will fight harder for you than I have ever fought for anything, including this land, including anything Mr. Crane thinks he can take from us. Even harder than you fought for Molly. Even harder than that. Clara managed something close to a real smile at the comparison, grateful for a moment of lightness in a day that had offered precious little of it. Now close your eyes. Whatever happens with judges and hearings, you've still got school in the morning, and I won't have you falling asleep at your lessons on my account. Mary settled back against her pillow, some of the worry easing from her small face, though not all of it. And Clara sat with her until her breathing evened into sleep, thinking about courtrooms and custody, and a fight that had somehow, in the space of a few short weeks, become about far more than a single cow at auction. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of preparation and waiting letters exchanged with Whitfield's clerk, careful conversations with Sheriff Dunmore about what testimony might help most, and beneath all of it, the harvest festival drawing closer, like a storm visible on the horizon, long before it arrived. 3 days before the festival, word came that Judge Whitfield's preliminary hearing had been scheduled for the very same day as the guardianship proceeding, both to take place at the circuit courthouse, the morning after the festival concluded. And Clara felt something almost like relief at having a fixed date. At last, even one that terrified her because uncertainty had become its own particular kind of torture. The night before the festival, Ethan came to the homestead uninvited, later than his usual visits after Mary had already gone to bed, and Clara met him on the porch with a lamp in her hand, surprised and not surprised at all to see him. Couldn't sleep, he admitted before she'd asked. Kept thinking about tomorrow, about the hearing after, and figured I'd rather say what needs saying tonight than carry it silent through everything that's coming. Say it then. He climbed the porch steps and stood closer than propriety strictly allowed, though Clara found she didn't care much for propriety in that particular moment. Whatever happens tomorrow at the festival, or after in that courtroom, I need you to know I'm not going anywhere, Clara. Not if Crane wins his hearing, not if the judge sides against us, not if this whole town turns its back on both of us before it's through. I've loved you since somewhere around that fence line, maybe before, and I've been waiting to say it plain, because I didn't want you deciding anything about us while you were drowning in everything else he's thrown at you." Clara's breath caught, and for a moment the weight of everything else, the debt, the hearing, the festival. Crane's ultimatum fell away entirely, leaving only the two of them standing close in lamplight, with a truth finally spoken aloud between them. "Ethan, you don't have to say anything back. Not tonight. I just needed you to know it going into tomorrow, whatever tomorrow brings." His hand found hers, gentle, tentative, in a way his usual steadiness rarely allowed itself to be. "I love you, Clara Whitmore. I love that little girl of yours like she was my own already. And I intend to keep fighting for both of you long after Crane's forgotten he ever tried to take you from me." She stepped closer, close enough that she could feel his breath, close enough that the space between them had shrunk to almost nothing. And for one suspended moment, she let herself want fully and without restraint the thing she'd been refusing to name since the day he first handed her back. A rope attached to a cow she'd thought she'd lost forever. "I love you too," she said, quiet, but certain, the words arriving easier than she'd expected once she finally let them come. "I've loved you for weeks now, Ethan, and I've been too frightened of losing everything to admit it even to myself." He kissed her, then gentle and searching, and Clara felt something long frozen inside her chest finally begin to thaw. Grief and fear, loosening their grip just enough to let something new take root in the space they'd occupied for 4 hard years. When they finally broke apart, both of them breathing unsteadily, Ethan pressed his forehead against hers. "Whatever happens tomorrow, we face it together. That's not a question, Clara. That's a fact, same as the sun coming up. Together." She agreed and found the word carried a weight of comfort she hadn't known she was starving for until it finally arrived. The harvest festival opened the next morning under a sky scrubbed clean of clouds. The town square transformed with bunting and tables of food, and the particular forced cheerfulness of a farming community determined to celebrate, despite a summer that had given them little enough to celebrate about. Clara arrived with Mary in her best dress, and Ethan met them near the entrance formal, in a way she hadn't seen him before, clearly having made some effort with his appearance that told her he understood exactly how much today mattered. They hadn't walked 20 feet into the square before Jedediah Crane appeared, flanked by 2 men Clara didn't recognize, moving toward them, with the particular confidence of a man who believed he still held every card worth holding. "Mrs. Whitmore, Mr. Calloway." He tipped his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "I trust you've come to give me your answer, given that today marks the deadline we agreed upon." "We agreed upon nothing, Mr. Crane. You issued an ultimatum, and I've spent these 3 weeks finding better options than the one you offered. Have you?" His smile didn't waver, though something sharper moved behind his eyes. "I understand you and Mr. Calloway have been sending letters to territorial judges, attempting to stir up trouble about fraud allegations that exist nowhere but in your imagination. I find that a curious use of your remaining time, Mrs. Whitmore, given how little of it you actually have. Judge Whitfield doesn't seem to think the allegations exist only in our imagination, Mr. Crane." Ethan's voice carried an edge Clara hadn't heard from him in days, controlled but unmistakably dangerous. "He's agreed to a preliminary hearing tomorrow morning. Same day, I understand, as a guardianship hearing you've arranged against Mrs. Whitmore." Something flickered across Crane's face, quick and calculating, before he recovered his composure. How efficient of the circuit court scheduling both matters together. I confess I hadn't realized Whitfield had moved so quickly. "I imagine you hadn't," Ethan said, "seeing as you've likely spent considerable effort trying to slow him down." A crowd had begun to gather at the edges of the conversation, drawn by the tension crackling between the 3 of them, and Clara felt the weight of dozens of eyes settling on her, on Ethan, on Crane. The whole town's curiosity finally converging on the confrontation that had been building for weeks in whispers and rumors. "Since we've an audience," Crane said, raising his voice slightly, playing to the gathering crowd, the way he always did. "Perhaps this is as good a time as any to discuss the matter plainly, Mrs. Whitmore. You have until this evening to give me your answer regarding my proposal. Marriage in exchange for forgiveness of your debt, And I might add the quiet withdrawal of certain concerns I've raised with the circuit court regarding your daughter's welfare." The crowd murmured, and Clara felt heat rising in her face. Humiliation and fury tangling together as Crane made public what she'd hoped to keep private, weaponizing an audience the same way he'd weaponized every other resource at his disposal. "You're using my daughter to force my hand in front of the whole town. I'm simply being transparent about the stakes, Mrs. Whitmore, since you've chosen to involve outside judges and territorial busybodies rather than settling this quietly between us." Crane's smile had turned razor thin. "I'd hoped for a more private conversation, but you and Mr. Calloway seem determined to make a spectacle of everything, so a public answer seems only fitting." Ethan stepped forward close enough to Crane that several people in the gathering crowd audibly caught their breath. "You want a public conversation, Crane? Let's have one. Tell these people about Franklin Pruitt, the county clerk who used to work under you before he moved south. Tell them about the pattern he's documented: manufactured debts, backdated notes, marriage proposals extended to widows the same week you've engineered their financial ruin." Crane's composure cracked visibly for the first time since Clara had known him, a flash of genuine alarm crossing his face before he mastered it. "I don't know what fabrications you're referencing, Mr. Calloway, but I'd be careful about slandering a man's reputation in front of witnesses. It's not slander if it's documented." Ethan pulled a folded copy of Pruitt's papers from inside his coat, the same evidence that had nearly been discovered the night Crane arrived with the sheriff, and held it up for the gathering crowd to see, though not close enough for anyone but Crane to read the specifics. 3 families besides the Whitmores, 6 years of the same pattern. All of it's in Judge Whitfield's hands as of this week, Mr. Crane, which means whatever happens with your ultimatum tonight, this isn't going away tomorrow. The crowd's murmur had grown louder, uneasy. Now several faces Clara recognized Otis from the feed store. Families she'd known for years exchanging glances that suggested old suspicions about Crane's business dealings were finally finding confirmation they'd never quite dared voice aloud. "That's a serious accusation, Calloway," one of the men flanking Crane said, stepping forward with his hand resting near his belt in a manner Clara didn't care for at all. "Careful how you throw around words like fraud in front of half the county. It's not an accusation, it's a fact sitting in a territorial judge's office as we speak." Ethan didn't so much as glance at the man, his attention fixed entirely on Crane. "You want to test whether I'm bluffing, Crane? Go right ahead and ignore Whitfield's hearing tomorrow. See how that looks to everyone standing here once the ruling comes down." Crane's jaw had tightened considerably, and for a moment Clara thought she saw something almost like panic behind his careful mask before he recovered, drawing himself up with the particular dignity of a cornered man determined not to show it. "Since we're airing matters publicly, Mr. Calloway, perhaps the town should hear something about you as well. About the real reason you left your father's ranch 3 years ago before it was ever foreclosed upon." Clara felt her stomach drop, some instinct warning her that whatever came next would land harder than anything Crane had thrown at them yet. "I was working a cattle drive in Texas," Ethan said, though something careful had entered his voice, a wariness that told Clara this wasn't simply a lie Crane could invent from nothing. "Same as I told Mrs. Whitmore already. Is that the whole of it?" Crane's smile had returned sharper now, sensing blood. "Because I have it on good authority that you left home after a rather violent altercation with a debt collector named Silas Reed, a man who worked at the time for this very bank. An altercation that left Mr. Reed with a broken jaw and 2 missing teeth, and left you, Mr. Calloway, with a warrant that only quietly disappeared after your father's ranch was sold, and Mr. Reed decided pursuing charges wasn't worth the trouble any longer." The crowd's murmur sharpened into something closer to shocked silence, and Clara turned to look at Ethan, searching his face for denial, for explanation, for anything that might soften the ugly shape of what Crane had just laid bare in front of the entire town. "Is that true?" Ethan's jaw had gone tight, his eyes fixed on Crane with an intensity that answered the question before his words did. "It's true that I hit Silas Reed. It's not true that it happened the way he's telling it." "Then tell me how it happened, Ethan, now plainly in front of whoever's listening." Clara heard the fear in her own voice, fear that the man she'd just confessed her love to the night before carried something darker inside him than she'd allowed herself to imagine. "Reed came to collect on the note before the foreclosure was even finalized, Showed up at my parents' house while my father was laid up sick in bed, and when my mother told him he'd have to wait for payment till my father recovered enough to discuss it, Reed shoved past her into the house, knocked her down, trying to get to the strongbox himself. Ethan's voice had dropped rough with old fury, finally given voice. I came home from the drive 2 days later to find my mother with a bruised hip she wouldn't fully explain, and when I rode into town and found Reed at the saloon bragging about putting a widow woman in her place, I hit him. Once. Hard enough to break his jaw, and I've never once regretted it, whatever it cost me afterward. The crowd's silence had shifted again. Something in the collective mood, softening at the details Crane had conveniently left out of his own telling, and Clara felt her own fear ease slightly replaced by something closer to fierce protective anger on Ethan's behalf. "You put your hands on his mother," she said, turning on Crane with a fury that surprised even herself. "Your own employee assaulted an ailing woman in her home, and you're standing here using the consequences of that assault as ammunition against the son who defended her." "I wasn't employed by the bank at the time of that particular incident," Crane said smoothly, though something in his composure had frayed further the crowd's shifting sympathy, clearly not the outcome he'd anticipated. And regardless of the circumstances, the fact remains that Mr. Calloway has a documented history of violence which seems relevant to any discussion of his suitability as an influence on a young child. The fact remains. Sheriff Dunmore's voice cut through the crowd, and Clara turned to see him pushing forward, having clearly been drawn by the commotion. "That I've never once seen Ethan Calloway raise a hand against anyone in this town, in all the years I've known him, and a man defending his mother from an assault 3 years ago in another county has got nothing to do with his character today, near as I can tell." "Sheriff Dunmore," Crane said, some strain finally audible beneath his composure, "I'd remind you that a formal guardianship hearing is scheduled for tomorrow, and matters of a man's documented violence are precisely the sort of evidence that hearing exists to consider. Then let the judge consider it tomorrow in a proper courtroom, alongside whatever evidence Mrs. Whitmore and Mr. Calloway have gathered about your own dealings, Mr. Crane, rather than airing it all here in the middle of a harvest festival, like we're settling scores at a cockfight." Sheriff Dunmore's tone brooked no argument, and Clara watched something in the crowd's energy shift decisively. Sympathy tilting away from Crane and toward the two people he'd tried to publicly destroy. Crane seemed to recognize the shift too, his expression tightening with the particular frustration of a man watching a carefully constructed advantage slip away in real time. "Fine. Let the judge consider everything tomorrow. But I'll remind you, Mrs. Whitmore, that my original ultimatum still stands. This evening you give me your answer about marriage, or I proceed with every legal remedy available to me, regardless of what happens in Whitfield's courtroom. You'll have your answer, Mr. Crane." Clara stepped closer to Ethan, close enough that their shoulders touched deliberate and public, a declaration she hadn't planned to make so plainly, but found herself making anyway, in front of the whole gathered town. "My answer is no. It was no the moment you first suggested it, and it will be no tomorrow, and it will be no every day after that, whatever it costs me. I would rather lose this land honestly than keep it by marrying a man who built his fortune destroying families like mine." The crowd's reaction was immediate and unmistakable, a ripple of something like approval moving through the gathered townspeople, several voices murmuring agreement, and Clara felt something fierce and unshakable settle into her chest. The particular strength that came from finally saying a hard truth in front of everyone who needed to hear it. Crane's face had gone rigid with barely contained fury, all pretense of gentlemanly patience finally stripped away. "You'll regret that answer, Mrs. Whitmore. I promise you that. I regret a great many things, Mr. Crane. Marrying to save myself from a man I despise will never be one of them." She turned deliberately away from him, taking Ethan's hand in front of the entire crowd, a gesture that would ensure every tongue in Valentine was wagging by nightfall, and found she didn't care in the slightest what any of them made of it. "Mary, come along. We've a festival to enjoy, whatever else this day has brought." Crane watched them walk away, his men flanking him in tense silence, and Clara didn't look back, though she could feel the weight of his stare following her across the square like a physical thing, promising trouble that hadn't yet finished arriving. That evening, After the festival's lanterns had been lit and most of the town had settled into the easier rhythms of music and dancing, Ethan found Clara sitting alone at the edge of the gathering, watching Mary chase fireflies with a knot of other children in the deepening dusk. "You didn't have to say all that. About marrying to save yourself, in front of everyone. I meant every word of it." Clara looked up at him, searching his face for any lingering doubt about the story he'd told, the fight, the broken jaw, the warrant that had chased him quietly out of his own life. "I need to ask you something. Ethan and I need you to answer me honestly." "Anything." "When you hit Reed, when you saw what he'd done to your mother, did you feel like you couldn't stop yourself? Like the anger took over something in you that you couldn't control?" Ethan was quiet for a long moment, clearly understanding the deeper question buried inside the one she'd asked, the fear she hadn't spoken plainly, but that sat underneath every word regardless. "I felt every bit of that anger. Clara and I chose to hit him anyway, knowing full well what it might cost me. That's different from not being able to stop myself. I've never once raised a hand against anyone since, not because I couldn't, but because nobody's given me reason that felt like Reed's did, standing over my mother, while she held a bruised hip and told me not to make trouble." He met her eyes steadily. "I won't apologize for what I did to that man, Clara, but I understand if what Crane said tonight makes you wonder what kind of man you've let into your daughter's life. It doesn't make me wonder that." She reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his in the gathering dark. "It makes me understand you a little better than I did this morning. A man capable of that kind of fury on his mother's behalf is a man capable of that same fury protecting people he loves. I'm not frightened of that, Ethan. I think, if I'm honest, it's part of why I trust you as much as I do." Something in his shoulders eased tension he'd clearly been carrying since Crane first spoke Reed's name, finally releasing. "Tomorrow's going to be hard, whatever Whitfield decides, whatever that circuit judge makes of the guardianship petition. I know it. Whatever happens, Clara, I meant what I said last night. I'm not going anywhere." He pressed his forehead briefly against hers, the same gesture from the night before, already becoming something familiar between them. "We'll walk into that courthouse tomorrow together, and whatever Crane's built against us, we'll tear it down piece by piece, same as we've been doing since that auction." Clara nodded, watching Mary's small silhouette dart between fireflies in the deepening dark, and felt the weight of tomorrow settling over her like a held breath. 12 hours away now, carrying 2 hearings and a lifetime's worth of consequences, balanced on whatever a judge she'd never met decided to believe. She did not sleep well that night, turning over every possible outcome, every piece of evidence, every word Crane might produce to twist the story further in his favor. Somewhere near midnight, she rose and checked on Mary twice, needing the reassurance of her daughter's steady breathing more than she needed sleep herself. And by the second hour past midnight, she gave up entirely on rest and sat instead at her kitchen table, the same table Crane had once spread his fabricated documents across, running through every argument the circuit judge might raise, and every answer she might need ready before he'd finished asking. A single lamp burned low in the window as she worked, and somewhere out past midnight, she thought she heard a rider on the distant road, slow and careful. Though when she rose to check, the lane stood empty beneath a sky gone hard and starless, with the particular stillness that came before a long, uncertain day. She told herself it was nerves playing tricks with sound, and returned to her table and did not sleep again. Before dawn finally broke gray and cool over the homestead, Clara, dressed in her best remaining clothes, woke Mary gently and prepared to walk into a courthouse that would decide by day's end whether everything she'd fought to keep would still belong to her when the sun went down again. The circuit courthouse sat crowded to its walls by the time Clara and Ethan arrived, word of the previous evening's confrontation having spread through Valentine faster than any single rider could have carried it, and Clara felt the weight of every face turning toward her as she walked the aisle to the front bench, Mary's hand gripped tight in hers. Judge Harmon Whitfield sat at the bench with a stack of documents already before him, a lean, gray-haired man whose expression gave away nothing as he called the court to order and turned his attention first to the matter of fraudulent lending practices against Jedediah Crane. "Mr. Crane," Whitfield said, his voice carrying easily through the packed room. I've reviewed the materials submitted on behalf of the complainants, including sworn statements from a Franklin Pruitt, formerly employed by the county recorder's office, detailing a pattern of manufactured debt filings spanning 6 years, and no fewer than 4 families, including your own recent dealings with Mrs. Whitmore here present. Your Honor, I object to the characterization. You'll have your chance to respond, Mr. Crane, but I'll ask you to save it until I've finished. Whitfield's tone brooked no argument, and Clara felt something in her chest loosen slightly at the judge's evident lack of patience for Crane's usual performances. Mr. Pruitt's statement includes copies of altered mortgage filings bearing dates that predate the debts they claim to document, which is, to put it plainly, not how time generally works, Mr. Crane, unless you've discovered some means of collecting on obligations before they exist. A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the courtroom, quickly stifled, and Crane's face had gone the particular shade of red Clara recognized from the Harvest Festival, a man realizing in real time that the ground beneath him had shifted more than he'd accounted for. Your Honor, if I might, you might once I've asked you a direct question. Did you or did you not discover a so-called second mortgage note against the Whitmore property attributed to debts owed to a Dr. Ashworth, despite county records showing Dr. Ashworth deceased 3 years prior to the date on which you claim this debt originated? The silence that followed stretched long enough that Clara could hear her own heartbeat, and beside her, Ethan's hand found hers, beneath the bench, steady and warm, an anchor against the trembling she couldn't quite suppress. There may have been a clerical error in the dating of that particular document. Crane finally said, his voice considerably less smooth than it had been at any point since Clara first met him. A clerical error. Whitfield repeated the phrase with the flat, unimpressed tone of a man who had heard every variety of excuse a guilty party could offer. Mr. Crane, I've reviewed 4 separate instances of this particular clerical error across 6 years, each one conveniently discovered. At the moment a struggling family's note came due, each one accompanied by an offer of marriage or preferential terms in exchange for forgiveness of the newly discovered debt. I don't believe in coincidence quite that consistent. Crane said nothing, his composure finally visibly cracking under the weight of a judge who refused to be charmed or intimidated by either his money or his manner. It is the finding of this preliminary hearing, Whitfield continued, that sufficient evidence exists of fraudulent lending practices to warrant a full territorial investigation into Mr. Crane's banking activities effective immediately. Pending that investigation, all debts claimed against Mrs. Whitmore beyond the original verifiable mortgage balance are hereby voided, and Mr. Crane is barred from any further collection action or legal proceedings against her, including— And here, Whitfield's eyes moved deliberately to the second folder on his desk, the guardianship petition currently before this court, which I find on its face to be retaliatory in nature and without merit. Clara felt the breath leave her body, all at once. Relief crashing through her so completely that for a moment the courtroom blurred at its edges, and beside her, Mary let out a small, startled sound of joy that carried clear across the silent room. Your Honor. Crane began some last desperate attempt at composure surfacing. Surely a full investigation shouldn't preclude. Mr. Crane, I have before me sworn testimony documented fraud spanning half a decade and a pattern of predatory conduct toward vulnerable widows that I find frankly contemptible in a man entrusted with this community's financial well-being. You will have your chance to respond fully once the territorial investigators arrive, which I expect within the fortnight. Until then, this court finds no cause whatsoever to question Mrs. Whitmore's fitness as a guardian, and considerable cause to question your own fitness to hold a banking charter. Whitfield brought his gavel down with a crack that seemed to echo through the whole room. This hearing is concluded. The courtroom erupted into a low roar of conversation, and Clara found herself pulled into Ethan's arms before she'd fully processed what had happened. Mary wedged between them, all 3 of them holding on like the ground might still give way beneath their feet, despite everything the judge had just said. It's over, she said, disbelief still coloring her voice. Ethan, it's actually over. Not quite over, he said, though he was smiling the first full, unguarded smile she'd seen from him since the whole ordeal began. But close enough to taste it. Outside the courthouse, the crowd that had gathered spilled into the street, and Clara found herself surrounded by well-wishers she hadn't expected. Otis from the feed store gripping her hand with genuine warmth. Mrs. Odell nodding at her with something like pride. Sheriff Dunmore tipping his hat with quiet satisfaction at a job he'd clearly wanted to see through properly. "Told you I'd be watching how it unfolded, Mrs. Whitmore," the sheriff said. "Glad I got to watch it unfold this way instead of the other. I'm grateful for your testimony today, Sheriff. Truly. Wasn't testimony so much as the plain truth, ma'am. Easiest job I've had all year, telling a judge what I already knew to be so." He tipped his hat again and moved off through the crowd, and Otis Grant stepped up in his place, still wringing Clara's hand like he couldn't quite believe the morning's outcome himself. "I'll be extending your credit again come Monday. Mrs. Whitmore, same terms as always. And I'm sorrier than I can rightly say that I ever had to tell you otherwise. You did what you had to, Otis. I never held it against you. All the same, I mean to make it right." He released her hand finally and stepped back beaming, and Clara felt something warm settle in her chest at the sight of a town slowly finding its way back toward decency now that the man who'd been squeezing it for years had finally been caught at his own game. Crane emerged from the courthouse moments later, flanked by his two men, his face a mask of barely controlled fury, and for a moment Clara thought he might approach her, might attempt one final threat now that his careful construction had come crashing down in front of the entire county. Instead, he simply stopped, looked at her with something cold and calculating still burning behind his eyes, and spoke low enough that only she and Ethan could hear. "This isn't finished, Mrs. Whitmore. It is for you, Mr. Crane." Ethan's voice carried none of the fury Clara had heard from him before, only a settled, immovable certainty. Territorial investigators don't tend to look kindly on men who spend their time threatening the witnesses against them. "I'd think carefully about what you say next if I were you." Crane's jaw tightened, and for a long moment he simply stood there, some final calculation working behind his eyes before he turned without another word and walked toward his carriage, his men trailing behind him. And Clara watched him go with a strange mixture of relief and lingering wariness, unable to fully believe that a man who had haunted her every waking thought for weeks could simply walk away without one final blow. "Do you think he's truly finished?" she asked, watching the carriage pull away down the dusty street. "I think a territorial investigation into 6 years of fraud is going to keep him considerably busier than he's used to being." Ethan's arm settled around her shoulders, warm and solid. "Whatever he tries next, Clara, he's not trying it from a position of strength anymore. That's the difference that matters most." 3 days later, a letter arrived from the Territorial Bank Examiner's office confirming that Jedediah Crane had been formally suspended from his position pending the outcome of the investigation, and that a replacement bank manager, a woman named Constance Fairweather, with no ties whatsoever to Crane's previous dealings, would be arriving within the month to oversee the bank's affairs, and the letter specified to personally review and correct any outstanding irregularities in existing mortgage accounts. Clara read the letter aloud to Ethan on her porch that evening, Mary curled between them with Molly grazing contentedly in the yard beyond, and felt something settle inside her chest that had been holding tension for so long she'd nearly forgotten what its absence felt like. "My mortgage balance," she said, reading further. "The original balance without any of Crane's inventions attached to it. Mrs. Fairweather's confirmed it stands at $110 payable at the original terms, due at harvest's end, same as it always should have been. That's a debt you can actually pay. With the money I've saved and what the harvest brings in, and what you've been putting toward it, without ever once asking my permission first." She looked at him with mock severity that couldn't quite hide the gratitude underneath it. "I intend to pay you back every cent of that, Ethan Calloway, whatever protests you're about to offer." "I wasn't going to offer any protest at all." He caught her hand before she could pull away, threading his fingers through hers, with the same easy familiarity that had grown between them across weeks of fences mended and roofs patched, and a fight fought side by side. "Though I had hoped once the debt settled proper, we might talk about a different kind of arrangement between us. One that doesn't involve you paying me back for anything, seeing as I'd rather build something with you than keep a ledger of who owes who what." Clara felt her heart catch, understanding exactly what he was circling toward without yet saying it plain. Ethan Calloway, are you asking me something or just talking in circles around it? I suppose I'm working my way toward asking you something, if you'll give me a moment to find the right words for it. He turned to face her fully, Mary watching with wide, delighted eyes from her spot on the porch step, clearly sensing something significant unfolding, even if she didn't yet understand its full shape. I've spent most of my adult life believing a home was something a man built once, and then spent the rest of his days trying to protect from everyone determined to take it from him. You've taught me these last months that a home's not really about the land at all, Clara. It's about who's standing on it beside you when the fighting's done. Ethan. I love you. I love that girl of yours like my own blood already. And I don't want to spend one more day pretending I'm just a neighbor who happens to mend your fences out of general goodwill. He drew a small breath, steadying himself. Marry me, Clara Whitmore. Not because either of us needs saving anymore, not because some bankers forced our hand, but because I can't imagine building whatever comes next with anybody but you standing beside me. Mary let out a delighted shriek before Clara had even managed to answer, scrambling up from the porch step to throw her arms around both of them at once, and Clara found herself laughing through sudden tears, the particular joy of a happiness she'd stopped believing she was allowed to want anymore. Yes, she said, and then, because once didn't feel like enough, yes, Ethan, 1,000 times yes. He kissed her there on the porch, with Mary wedged happily between them, and Molly lowing softly in the yard beyond, and Clara thought for the first time in 4 long years that the house behind her no longer felt like a burden she carried alone, but like the first solid brick in something new she was building together, with 2 people who loved her exactly as fiercely as she loved them back. They married 3 weeks later on a Saturday morning when the first real rain in months finally broke over Valentine, Nebraska, soaking the parched fields and filling the well that had run low all summer, and Clara stood on her own porch in a dress Mrs. Odell had helped her sew from good blue cotton. Watching Ethan walk up the lane in his one good coat with an expression on his face like a man who still couldn't quite believe his own good fortune. "Rain on your wedding day," Reverend Hale said, smiling as he opened his book to the proper page. "Some folks call that bad luck. I call it the land finally agreeing with the rest of us that something good's about to happen," Clara said. And beside her Mary giggled, clutching a small bouquet of wildflowers she'd picked herself that morning, insisting she needed flowers too, since she was going to be the most important person there, besides the bride and groom. The ceremony was small, no more than a dozen neighbors gathered in Clara's yard, beneath a sky finally washed clean of its long summer drought. But Clara had never in her life felt a room or a yard or a moment so completely full. Ethan's hands shook slightly when he took hers, an unexpected tremor in a man who'd faced down bankers and sheriffs and a courtroom full of strangers without ever once losing his composure. "You're nervous?" she whispered before the Reverend could begin. "Terrified," he admitted low enough that only she could hear. "Never once in my life have I wanted anything as badly as I want to get the next few minutes right." "You already got the hardest part right, Ethan Calloway. Everything after this is just details." He laughed, some of the tension breaking from his shoulders, and when Reverend Hale asked if he took Clara Whitmore to be his lawfully wedded wife, his voice came out steady and sure, carrying clear across the yard to every neighbor who'd once whispered about a widow's reputation and now stood there smiling instead. Mrs. Odell cried through most of the ceremony, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief she'd clearly brought prepared for exactly that purpose, and afterward she pulled Clara aside with fierce, unexpected affection. "I'm glad I decided to be wrong about you, Clara Calloway. Gladder than I know how to say properly. You helped sew this dress, Mrs. Odell. I'd say that more than makes up for anything that came before. Sewing a dress is easy. Admitting you were wrong about somebody takes considerably more thread." Mrs. Odell squeezed her hand once hard and moved off to fuss over the small spread of food the neighbors had brought. Otis Grant found her a few minutes later, his wife on his arm, both of them beaming in a way Clara had rarely seen from either. "Never thought I'd see the day Valentine had a wedding worth closing the store for Mrs. Calloway. Glad I got to witness it. I'm glad you came, Otis. Truly. Wouldn't have missed it for anything. Feels like the whole town's finally exhaling something it's been holding a long while." He tipped his hat and moved off to find the cider, and Clara watched him go with something warm settling permanently into the place where old worry used to sit. The months that followed passed, the way seasons always passed, on a working homestead full of labor and small triumphs. The harvest coming in better than Clara had dared hope, once the drought finally broke enough to pay off the mortgage in full before the year's end and set aside savings besides. Territorial investigators arrived within the promised fortnight and confirmed everything Pruitt's documents had suggested, and Jedediah Crane stood trial the following spring for fraud spanning 6 years and 4 families convicted on every count, his bank charter revoked permanently, his name becoming in Valentine a byword for the particular cruelty of men who mistook other people's desperation for opportunity. Clara heard the verdict secondhand, delivered by Sheriff Dunmore, who rode out specially to tell her himself, and found she felt less triumph in the news than a quiet, settled relief, the particular piece of a threat finally permanently removed from the edges of her life. Told you I'd be watching how it unfolded, and gladder than I know how to say properly that it unfolded the way it did, the sheriff added before Clara could reply further. 15 years, territorial prison effective immediate. I thought you'd want to hear it plain rather than through town gossip. Thank you, Sheriff, for everything really. I don't think I ever properly said that. You said it plenty, Mrs. Calloway. Actions count for more than words most days, and you fought that battle about as bravely as anybody I've watched come through this county. He paused at the edge of the yard, turning back once more. For what it's worth, ma'am, I've seen a great many hard things happen to good people in this line of work. It does my heart considerable good to see one turn out right for once. He tipped his hat and rode off, and Clara stood in her yard a long moment, feeling the particular lightness of a burden finally fully lifted. By the following spring, Mary had a baby brother born on a warm morning in April, with Ethan pacing the porch outside, until the midwife finally called him in, and Clara watched him hold his son for the first time with an expression of such raw, unguarded wonder that she felt her own heart nearly break open with love for him all over again. "He's got your eyes," Clara said, watching Ethan cradle the baby with the same careful attention he'd once given a fence post that needed setting just right. God help him then. Storm eyes never brought anybody much peace. They brought me plenty of peace, Ethan Calloway. More than I knew what to do with once I stopped being too frightened to accept it. What'll we call him? Ethan asked, his voice thick with an emotion he made no effort to hide. Thomas, Clara said, watching his face carefully for any flicker of hesitation. After Mary's father. I'd like our son to carry his name forward if that doesn't trouble you. Nothing about that troubles me, Clara. A boy could do worse than carry forward the name of a man who built the very house we're standing in. Ethan looked down at the baby in his arms, then at Mary, who'd climbed up onto the bed to inspect her new brother with the same serious scrutiny she'd once applied to fence posts. Seems to me a family's not about who came first or who came second. It's about everybody deciding to build the same thing together, whatever shape that building takes. Mary, satisfied with her inspection, declared, Baby Thomas acceptable, though she informed her parents plainly that she still intended to be in charge of him being older and considerably more experienced in matters of the homestead. And Clara laughed until tears came, the particular joy of watching her daughter grow into exactly the kind of fierce, capable young woman Clara had always hoped she might become. 2 more years brought a daughter. They named Grace and Molly. Grown old and gentle in her pasture, lived long enough to see both younger children learn to walk beside her, tottering across the yard with fistfuls of grass to feed her, and Clara often found herself standing at her kitchen window watching the scene, thinking back to a town square auction and a stranger's voice cutting through a crowd's cruel laughter, hardly able to reconcile that desperate morning with the abundance that had grown from it. The homestead itself had transformed too. A new wing added to the house the second summer of their marriage, the barn rebuilt sturdy and true. The fence lines Ethan had first mended, now stretching further than Thomas Whitmore had ever managed to build them. Encompassing land, Ethan had purchased fair and square, from a grateful Otis Grant, who'd decided farming suited him considerably less than running the feed store, and was glad to sell his failing acreage to a man he trusted. On a summer evening, some 5 years after that first terrible auction, Clara sat on her porch watching her husband teach their son to whittle a small wooden horse. Mary nearby, reading a book borrowed from the traveling schoolteacher Grace, asleep against her mother's shoulder. And she thought with the particular clarity that sometimes arrived in quiet moments that she had built something here far sturdier than any fence or any mortgage, something that no banker's manufactured debt could ever again threaten to take away. "You're thinking hard about something," Ethan said, glancing up from the whittling to catch her watching him. "I'm thinking about how far we've come from a woman standing in a town square with nothing left to sell but a cow nobody wanted to buy." "Somebody wanted to buy her?" Ethan said, setting down his knife and crossing to sit beside her on the porch step. $50 worth of wanting, if I recall correctly. You gave the money back. And the cow. Best decision I ever made, giving away something I'd just paid for. He wrapped an arm around her shoulders, careful not to disturb Grace's sleep, and looked out over the land they'd built together from the wreckage of a crueler man's ambition. "I've thought about that morning plenty of times since, Clara. About what would have happened if I'd kept walking past that auction instead of stopping. You'd have regretted it. The same way you regretted not helping your father sooner. I would have, but I think about it less as avoiding a regret these days, and more as the morning my whole life actually started, whether I recognized it at the time or not." He pressed a kiss to her temple, gentle and certain. "Every good thing I've got now traces back to that one moment of deciding a stranger's dignity mattered more than the $50 in my pocket." Clara leaned into him, watching her children in the golden evening light. The fence lines standing straight and true across land that had nearly been stolen from her by a man who mistook cruelty for cleverness, and felt something settle permanently into place inside her chest. A certainty as solid and unshakable as the house behind her. Jedediah Crane had believed that a widow's desperation was his to exploit that dignity, was a luxury poor women couldn't afford to keep that kindness offered. Without strings was a foolishness no sensible man would ever practice. He had been wrong on every count, and the proof of that wrongness sat scattered across Clara Calloway's porch in the shape of a husband who'd chosen decency over profit, a daughter who'd learned to trust again after loss, taught her fear, and 2 younger children who would grow up never once knowing what it felt like to stand in a town square with nothing left to their name but a single frightened cow. The auctioneer's gavel that had once threatened to take everything from her had instead, in the strange and unpredictable arithmetic of a hard summer, given her back a life worth considerably more than anything Crane's schemes had ever managed to take. And Clara Calloway understood, watching the sun set, gold and steady over the fields her family had reclaimed, that some losses were only ever the beginning of a story, never its final ending. She had lost a cow to an auctioneer's gavel, and gained in its place everything that mattered most. And that was a truth no banker, no courtroom, and no cruelty this world could ever again take from her.